Is there any kind of national movement to get conservative religious people on school boards, or is that just happening individual community level? Or?
I'm not aware of an organized effort to elect conservative or creationist school board members. But that's certainly, if you go back to the 1980s and the 70s and the origins of the moral majority and the conservative Christian right groups in that era, that's certainly where they started. And it's an excellent place for people who are interested in improving science education to get started also. It's incredibly easy to run for school board. School boards are some of the smallest political units. So you're basically, to do that, you're knocking on your neighbor's doors and saying, I think we should have good schools, will you vote for me, right? It's not hard, and I would encourage you to think about doing that if you're at all interested and you have the time and energy. It's well worth doing, and it's because that's where the policy is made. Decisions about whether evolution is to be taught or whether climate change is to be taught are made by local school boards and by teachers in the school districts. It's not made so much by the state, it's not really made by the feds, it's made by those local school boards. So I don't know who's running, but I don't know of an organized effort to get conservatives or creationists to do that, but there should be organized efforts to get people who support evolution and climate change education. And I hope that you'll all consider that yourselves. Not, of course, as a 501c3, NCSE couldn't endorse you, but you know.
Was Bill Nye fully aware of Ken Ham's very manipulative and divisive and dishonest tactics before going in?
How much Bill Nye knew about the history of creationist debate and creationist debate tactics, I don't know going into it. Certainly when we were talking to him, and I know that he was also meeting with other folks. He lives in Los Angeles, and so there Michael Shermer lives in the area and has done some debates with creationists over the years. Don Prothero lives in the area. So I know that he was talking to us at NCSE, he was talking to them, and probably to other folks as well, who I think he had an idea of what he was getting himself into and was trying to prepare to the extent that one can for something like that.
Is there any specific advice that you would give for raising young daughters in this society that would perhaps help avoid some of those pitfalls?
No, I don't really have any advice. I raised two daughters, and one of them does all kinds of masculine things. She took after her father and learned to fix things and take things apart and put them back together, and the other one turned out to be the artsy type, and she doesn't have those skills at all, but she's a very independent young woman, and I think both of our daughters ended up with the idea that they could do anything they wanted to do. I don't have any special tips. I wish I did.
You mentioned in your speech that there's a lot of variations in the studies done on gender differences. Did you notice a variation in those variations depending on the region those studies were conducted in?
No, I was really depending on secondary sources of other people who had analyzed all the studies, and I don't know about any trends like that. There have been so many studies, it would be impossible to read them all. So I depended on summaries of people who knew a lot more about it than I did.
Could you highlight the differences between an androgynous individual and a gender-neutral individual? I've always been a little confused about that classification.
Well, that's a good question. I would think that androgynous meant they had some characteristics of women and some characteristics of men, whereas gender neutral would be someone who was kind of midline and didn't really have either masculine or feminine traits. I don't know. I don't know what the dictionary would say.
Could you talk about parental investment and what your research would suggest about that?
I'm not sure what you mean by that. Could you clarify?
Sex differences in parental investment, male versus female parental investment is.
Well, obviously the female is more invested in the just by the fact that she has the baby in her body for 9 months and feeds it and takes care of it. And in most societies, in most situations, the mother is the one who does all the child care. So she invests a great deal, whereas the man isn't obligated to invest anything more than one dose of sperm. So, yeah, there's a biological difference there, and you can compare human behavior to animal behavior, and you see the same thing in a lot of animals where the female has to devote a lot more resources to raising a baby than the male does. But there's a lot of variation in nature, and the fact of investment doesn't say how people have to behave. There's no reason that men can't be just as involved in raising children as women. And I know my husband was. He was the one who fixed our girls' hair. I don't do hair. I don't like hair. And he would braid their hair and do all kinds of things. And he was a much better mother than I was. When one of our daughters was in daycare at the base one time, I went to pick her up, and she went running towards me, and she said, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy," and the lady said, "That's not your daddy." And I said, "Don't worry, I know how she feels about her daddy, and if she wants to confuse me with him, I consider that a compliment."
I was wondering what your most common, or what the most common creationist argument that you most often hear, or what the most funniest one is.
The most common or funniest creationist argument? That's a good question. Because, certainly people they'll call up NCSE and just want to pick a fight, right? They don't have any particular agenda. Let's say, "Oh, yes, I would like to discuss fossils." And it'll just sort of go wherever it goes because they want to argue with someone for a while. And it usually, I don't know, it probably usually starts off with there are no transitional fossils, and then where does genetic information come from? Sometimes it'll get to where does sex come from? It's a good question. Because, I mean, it's not an easy question, right? Why should we have two sexes? It's elaborate and complicated and leads to all this confusion. And what do we get for it, right? Well, we get there are various things we get for it, but it makes life more interesting, to be sure. And evolutionarily, you get genetic diversity from it and all sorts of cool stuff. But how does that start off? How do you get anisogamy, right? Why do you have sex gametes that are of different sizes that have to meet up to fertilize? Sometimes that comes up. But usually, the interesting thing about it is that you can sort of spend a long time on the phone with people, and they'll try all of those. They'll throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, and you have an answer for it, and they move on to the next thing. And eventually, if you can bring the conversation around to the religious and political context, that's where you have the actual interesting conversation, because people do not become creationists because they're thinking carefully about genes, and they're like, "Oh my God, there's no possible way that a gene could evolve. I should become a creationist," right? They're sitting there saying, I'm reading the Bible, I'm going to church, my pastor is telling me, my parents are telling me, whoever is telling me that to be a good Christian, I have to reject evolution, so evolution must be wrong. And here are these scientific reasons that people are putting out there that explain why it's wrong. And so if you can go to them and say, look, there are guys like Francis Collins, who's the director of the National Institutes of Health, formerly the director of the Human Genome Project, right? Serious scientist by any measure, and evangelical Christian, has no problem with evolution, right? Read his book. If they're an evangelical Christian, read his book, come back to me, because I'm not an evangelical Christian, right? I'm a secular Jew from the Bay Area. No one wants to know what I think about religion, right? I mean, just honestly, no one wants to know what I think about religion. It doesn't matter. I'm not part of their tribe. They don't need to hear it from me. They need to hear it from Francis Collins. They need to hear it from Ken Miller, who's a Catholic. And if if I'm talking to an evangelical, I don't say anything about Ken Miller, because for them, Catholics may not actually be Christians, just the way it works. But someone from their tribe, someone who reads the Bible the way that they do and doesn't have a problem with evolution. And if you can make that connection, then you can say, then come back and talk to me about the science. I know about the science. I can't tell you how to be a Christian. That's not my job, but I know about the science. And then, but that lets them, I think of it as getting the fingers out of their ears so that you can have the interesting conversation. Because otherwise, yeah, they'll pick up any weird thing that someone said that must be why evolution is wrong because they heard it somewhere and they know evolution's wrong. So any anti-evolution argument, they're going to pick up and run with. So finding ways to get them past that and to get at the underlying issues is really the key thing. And it's the same thing with any sort of science denial. Whether you're talking about climate change, you're talking about vaccines, you're talking about alternative medicines. What is it that got someone interested in that in the first place? Talk about that. And then you can talk about what the real science is. But until you address the underlying thing, it's impossible to have that conversation.
You alluded earlier to some of the climate change denialism and some of the parallels. I'm interested if there's something uniquely American about the issue of evolution and climate, just kind of science denialism in general. I bring it up because I was involved with a group called ICLEI, which focuses on sustainability internationally, and involved in some conferences with them. And the United States withdrew a lot of their support from ICLEI because of the climate change issue, that there were some conservative politicians that didn't like that they had accepted climate change science and that they were working toward sustainability in that effort. And it was in Mexico, a deeply religious country, and we had a very interesting conversation in which they found it funny, and it was humiliating to me that Americans had such a problem with evolution and with climate change within the same context. And so in a deeply religious country, their assertion was that it was widely accepted, that by the masses it was a widely accepted thing. So I guess the question on the basis is there something uniquely American about this denial of science?
Whether and why there's a linkage between those different forms of science denial and maybe others that are out there is an interesting question. I'm certainly interested in it. I don't know that there's a well-defined answer. But certainly creationism starts out in the United States. It starts out with, young earth creationism starts out as a Seventh-day Adventist movement in the late 1800s, early 20th century. It's a modern phenomenon, right? The idea of rejecting evolution in that way is quite modern, and it's American. We've exported it. Ken Ham is from Australia. He managed to pick it up over there and bring it back here. And in places like Mexico, the Catholic Church has not really got any problem with evolution. And so in Latin America, there's generally not a problem, except that there are a lot of American missionaries who go out and are setting up churches all over the world and bringing that particular theology with them. And so just last year or the year before in South Korea, a group was trying to get examples like Archaeopteryx out of science textbooks. South Korea, it's interesting, is the only country that sends more missionaries out to the rest of the world than South Korea is the United States. It's a quite religious country, even though it's much more, the Christian plurality in the population is not as large as it is in the United States. So it's a very evangelical Christian population in South Korea. The politics of the country are fascinating. You get a lot in Turkey, which is, in a sense, the fact that it's a problem there to a greater degree than in the rest of the Muslim world is an indication that Turkey it's actually being taught there. Turkey is right at the edge of Europe. When the more progressive, more secular parties are in power, they put evolution into the textbooks. They reprint the textbooks every year. When the more Islamist parties are in power, if they happen to control the education ministry, they take it out of the textbooks. And Mount Ararat is in Turkey. So every time that American creationists wanted to go do an expedition to find Noah's Ark, they would go to Turkey and they would leave lots of creationist material behind. And so there is this weird homegrown Islamic creationist movement that largely subsists on translated versions of American creationist material. And there are Islamic forms of creationism that are not from that tradition at all. So it happens around the world, but it's largely an American phenomenon. Climate change denial, at this point, the Republican Party is basically the only major political party in the world that is dominated by climate change denial. Whether that's linked is hard to say. There's certainly, if you look at public opinion polls, there's a correlation between rejection of evolution and rejection of climate change. And there's some psychological studies that suggest that if you can do something to reduce people's confidence in one form of science, it may have that sort of generalized effect. But I haven't seen anything that makes me so confident that I can say that that's the cause. It may just be the vagaries of our weird American political system and religious system and everything else. The economic libertarianism on one hand and the religious fundamentalism on the other hand happen to parallel each other, not necessarily out of any common cause. I don't know.
I read a book by Ronald Numbers about the creationists, and it describes the variations in strategy and approach that various creationists have taken over time and how their efforts have changed. Today, do you see more variation in their tactics or more narrowing of their approaches?
At this point, the creationist movement in the US politically is basically dominated by the young earth creationists, by groups like Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research. Ron Numbers' book is really about what's happening starting in the 20s, but especially in the 30s and 40s, as the old earth creationist movement that really dominated then. William Jennings Bryan, who prosecuted John Scopes for teaching evolution, didn't think that the earth was 6,000 years old. Or at least he wasn't committed to that. He was more of a day-age creationist, which is sort of saying, well, there are 6 days of creation. A day to the Lord is as 1,000 years, so we don't really, those are just periods of creation. They're not of a defined length necessarily. They weren't 24-hour days. And that sort of old earth creationism really dominated until the 60s when Henry Morris and Charles Whitcomb published a book called The Genesis Flood, which laid out this idea that the earth was created in 6 days, Noah's flood was global and literal, and it destroyed all life, and everything that we see around us today came off of Noah's Ark. Right? That idea just takes off in the 60s and is now really the dominant form of creationism. Although if you do polls and ask people about it, if you ask people, is the earth 10,000 years old or less? About 10% or 18% of people say yes. If you ask people, was the universe created by God less than 10,000 years ago? Something like 36% say yes. So it's the same question, right? Like, there's people, the way that people respond to the question, if you put a religious frame on it, they're going to answer it differently than if you put a scientific frame on it. Opinion is variable in that sense, but really constant over time. And we've got these academic freedom bills that are being proposed in lots of state legislatures. There have been about 50 in the last 7 or 8 years that have been filed. 2 of them became law in Louisiana and Tennessee. And that's a strategy that comes out of the Discovery Institute in Seattle, which used to be really focused on promoting intelligent design. And since intelligent design failed in court, they've been using this other strategy. But the foot soldiers of it, there is no large mass movement of intelligent design advocates. They're relying on those young earth creationists for a lot of the political muscle.
I'm not up on the current research, but I used to, when I taught these courses on developmental psych, one of the things that we found was that in most families, it's the father who insists on the differences between boys and girls. Is that still the case in your research?
I don't know of any research that addressed that, but it makes sense to me. I would think it's probably true. I know fathers typically tell their boys, act like a man, boys don't cry, and things like that.
Well, big thank you to our speakers tonight. Appreciate it.